As we all know, farmers and ranchers are vital to the health of the Canadian economy. But every year, they take a risk with weather conditions and global market changes. Joining us from Lethbridge is Ken Coles. He's the Executive Director of Farming Smarter. Ken, welcome back to Bridge City News. Always great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks to have me. How you doing?
Doing great over here. Now, first of all, for those that don't know about you or Farming Smarter, can you just share a little bit about what Farming Smarter does as an organization and how you provide help to the ag industry, which is such a big part of Southern Alberta?
You betcha. Well, we like to consider ourselves an innovation hub, and we're focused in on Southern Alberta. So we're a regional group, kind of south of Highway 1 is our main area of interest and efforts. And as an innovation hub, we like to be able to support farmers in their developments of new ideas, new approaches, new farming practices, new crops, new technologies, but to provide it a little bit of science-based information. So we have a testing program, an agronomy research program where we'll do small plot trials in various different means and partnered with different people, experts from across the country. We'll then scale it up to our field tested program where sort of the best things that we've learned we'll do on-farm trials and make sure that we tweak and adapt the practices and processes so they make sense to farmers. And then, we try to share everything that we do between our knowledge network and that kind of extension effort. So it's making sure that we're sharing the knowledge and information that we have, but we're also hearing and getting feedback from farmers, from agronomists, from industry. So kind of bring the folks together and try to solve some problems and address some opportunities that are going on. There's a fourth program that we do have, and we work with sort of emerging companies in our commercial innovation. So we help test out products or practices in this area so that they can be connected with what matters to farmers.
Now, the federal Conservatives put forth a private member's bill, C-234. It's also known as the Farm Heating Bill. And it's been getting a lot of attention recently because basically if this bill passes, it would exempt farmers from paying the carbon tax on propane and natural gas used to heat barns and dry grain. So the Liberals are saying no to this, and some are upset, and farmers really, including here in Southern Alberta. Ken, what kind of impacts are we talking about here if farmers were to be exempt on the carbon tax?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a really delicate and interesting situation that we're in, and it's a global thing. Climate change efforts are sort of top of mind in many governments, and lots of sort of political will and agenda towards that, and that influences everything, even including food production. So on the side challenge to that is that we're seeing this really tremendous inflation run right now. So everything is super expensive, cost of food. So now we've almost got these competing priorities. How do we get inflation and cost of living down, and at the same time, innovate and be good in the agricultural sector? So I think they're kind of conflicting interests, and I think that there's been some political moves on our provincial government as we're kind of getting closer to elections and leadership issues. So certainly that move on the eastern coast to sort of remove the carbon tax on heating oil for homes has kind of elevated that challenge. And I think when the agricultural bill is coming in now, seen as it's more of a conservative or Western Canadian type effort, now it's like, okay, are we going to punch all kinds of holes into our national climate strategy?
So do you feel that, because you said that that climate change appears to be on the top of government priorities, do you feel that federal and provincial governments don't have their priorities in order?
I think that there's a difference in opinions. It's no surprise to see that our conservative provincial government are sort of going to bats against the federal government in many different ways. And this is another example of that, I think. I'm not a politician, but it's pretty obvious. I was actually in Ottawa last week and met with some senators, met with some MPs, and there was lots of discussion around that subject. But it's definitely a little bit trickier than sort of perceived in the media.
And what kind of feedback are you getting on the farm heating bill from Southern Alberta farmers?
Well, I think farmers in general in Western Canada are I think in favor of not being taxed for a lot of their efforts. And then, the bill doesn't cover everything. I mean, even here in southern Alberta, the pumping costs for irrigation, there's a huge amount of carbon tax that goes on that. So
Wow.
in the end, everything gets pushed back down to the consumers, and that's why we're starting to see compounding effects and higher costs of food. So it's a challenging situation. Agriculture wants to be seen as a solution to climate change, but at the same time, how do we do it in a way that doesn't compromise, something that's important to everybody, and that's the cost of food.
We had some pretty dry conditions here in southern Alberta this year, and that typically results in below average crops. Do you have any stats on how we performed this year?
I don't have any hard stats for you, but it was a pretty hard drought here in southern Alberta. I think surprisingly, we did get sort of rain at right times that were allowed us to get a crop. It wasn't a complete crop failure, but in the dryland area, obviously yields were depressed quite significantly. Irrigation held pretty strong, and we actually had a nice hot summer, so lots of heat units and crops performed quite well. So the problem is, though, now our reservoirs are empty, and it's becoming a challenging situation. So we're going to need to see lots of snowfall in the mountains and hopefully some rains and snow over the winter.
And on the subject of dry conditions, how would growing hemp perform in our region, especially with these dry conditions? Like if it grows well here, that could really take off as hemp has such a plethora of uses. What have you heard?
Yeah, well, hemp is certainly an interesting crop, and it's a novel crop, one that I'm interested in seeing develop over, the next couple of decades. I was just at the Canadian Hemp Trade Alliance meeting in Edmonton last week. Unfortunately, the industry is a bit on a lull right now, and it goes in sort of bursts of excitement, and people get into the industry, and then you get an oversupply. So that industry is still developing. It's not necessarily a fantastic option as a drought mitigation tool, but it does have a really good carbon sequestration benefit that I think is something we need to consider more. As far as the research is concerned that we've done in hemp over the last number of years, most of it's been under irrigation. And just because it's such a high value crop, or it should be a high value crop if the markets would develop appropriately.
So are there any specialty crops that did really well this past year?
Well, I think it's hard to pinpoint whether one crop did better. I mean, there are crops that have a little bit more drought tolerance than others. The heat was actually a bit of a factor on some of the flowering crops. So we have cool season crops like canola, but that can be a challenge. But the stuff that we have in rotations like the legumes and the peas and that sort of stuff has done pretty well. But I think probably what's the bigger factor is that our farming systems are dealing better with drought now. So we've got a better adoption of zero tillage. We've got good cover of soil and good rotations that mix up, crops that have deep roots and shallow roots. And overall, I think, all farmers would say that if we had this level of drought 20 or 30 years ago, that it would have been catastrophic. So I think it is a testament to the practices and the farming techniques that farmers are using today.
And every so often we hear the news of the number of family farm operations declining. Is that statistically true? Is the number dropping? And if so, what's causing it?
Well, from my understanding, I think the number of farms in general is decreasing. It's kind of an economies of scale. So larger, more specialized, diverse farms are succeeding. It doesn't mean that they're not still family farms. They're just bigger family farms. So I think that's a natural progression that we're seeing within the industry that's been going on for a number of years.
Are we seeing that maybe these smaller family farms being acquired by corporations or larger family farms or mergers of any sorts?
Well, it's usually neighbors that are picking up land, or sometimes people are retiring. They don't have kids that are going into farming. There's certainly, it's difficult to have a profitable farm unless you have an adequate land base, and sometimes those smaller farms just can't cut it unless they've got some value added business component to it. So it's one of those things that it's kind of the nature of the beast of the industry, and I think that's just the way she's going.
And farming has become a very high-tech business these days. Is there a measurable difference in success rates when you compare farmers who are staying up to date with technology as compared to those who just stay with the traditional older methods?
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting question, and there's been a lot of attention and focus on technology as sort of the next big thing in agriculture. Being involved in this field, I've seen a lot of high tech approaches not work well, and I think that if you don't marry the agronomy to the technology, then a lot of them are failing. So I think that's actually a challenge within our industry right now, is that we might be a little too focused on technology and not looking at what actually matters on farms, because the level of effort that it requires to incorporate news, especially along the big data side of things, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of skill, and we've got so many bottlenecks in agriculture. So logistics sometimes will get in the way. I think that there's definitely an appetite for it, but there's also farmers that are sort of watching and waiting to see if there's truly value before they jump in.
And then what would you say to farmers watching who are old school? What do they need to change to become more profitable or sustainable?
Well, yeah, on the flip side, I do think that you always have to have an innovation mindset and innovation culture on your farm. It's just how you choose to evaluate it and when to adopt. And that's always a tricky thing. But so I would always keep an open mind, and I would never, I'd always encourage people, not to be afraid of failure in that sense, because sometimes in doing the exercise, trying things out, you actually learn something that you weren't even expecting to. So, I honestly do believe that it's worth putting some focused energy into that area, and look at ways at improving the resilience of your cropping systems, and always looking for ways to add value to your business as well. And there's lots of ways that can be done. It can be done through different crops, or it can be done through partnerships and so on.
And to those farmers who have invested in more advanced technology, how can they adapt older methods into their modern ways of farming?
Well, I think that's exactly the trick, right? And then the idea of innovation is that it's something new and something flashy, but sometimes it's about using an old idea and just applying it in a different way. So I think that again comes down to our sort of cultural approach and our perspective on innovation. So it's not always shiny. Sometimes it's simple, elegant solutions that are the most easily adoptable.
Now, Ken, we are seeing prices increase on both hogs and cattle. Is it the feed that is affecting these prices?
Well, feed plays a factor, but it really comes down to the market demand, and that can be a global impact. So we don't always know why things happen the way they happen.
Ken Coles is the Executive Director of Farming Smarter. Ken, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Naveen Day. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.